The sea did not sleep the night Orion was born. It roared against the shores of Boeotia, as if something ancient beneath its depths had stirred awake, something vast enough to remember the first storm ever spoken into existence. Waves struck the cliffs in violent rhythm, collapsing into foam and return, as though the ocean itself refused silence. Far inland, where salt wind still crawled through olive groves and stone valleys, a child drew his first breath. There are stories that contradict one another, as myths do when they attempt to contain what exceeds certainty. Some say Orion was not born but made, shaped from a childless king's longing and the strange mercy of wandering gods. Others whisper of 3 nameless travelers who arrived cloaked in rain that never touched the sky. They drank with King Hyrieus, and when the wine was gone, they asked his greatest desire. He did not ask for gold, not conquest, only a son. So they filled a bull's hide with divine seed, buried it beneath the earth, and told him to wait. A story meant to disturb reason, yet myth often carries the divine through what reason rejects. 9 months later, the earth split open there, and a child emerged as if the world had exhaled him. They named him Orion, but even as an infant, the name felt too small. He did not cry like other children. He observed. His eyes, dark as deep water, tracked movement before it happened. Servants felt measured under his gaze, as if already understood. And there was something else. The sea answered him. Near the coast, storms softened at his presence. Fishermen whispered of tides shifting unnaturally, as if Poseidon himself had turned inland. It was said the god of the sea visited him in dreams, not as man or beast, but as pressure, an infinite weight beneath waves without words. You are not land-born, not sea-born. You are what comes between. Whether prophecy or imagination, none could agree. But Orion never feared the ocean. He would stand at its edge for hours, listening to something beyond comprehension. He grew too quickly. By the time others learned animals, Orion understood silence. He did not learn hunting. He recognized it. Broken branches, disturbed stone, shifting wind. Each became language. It was unsettling, as if the world had chosen to teach him directly. Strength came the same way, without announcement. A boy lifting what men could not. A youth hauling nets alone when crews failed. Soon there was no doubt. Orion did not grow into strength. Strength grew into him, and it carried a stillness, as if power required no emotion. At 16, he killed his first great beast, a lion from the northern ridges, starving and wild. The village expected panic, evacuation, sacrifice. Orion walked into the fields alone. No armor, no forged weapon, only an oak branch sharpened to a point. When the lion charged, the earth seemed to hesitate, The encounter was brief, not battle, but resolution. Strike, fall, silence. He returned without speaking. He did not need to. Silence around him had changed. People said the forest recognized him. Wolves avoided his path not from fear, but understanding. Storms bent away as if refusing contact. Yet Orion did not belong to pride. Not yet. His parents taught restraint, humility, balance between man and nature. He listened as one listens to distant music, aware but untouched, because something larger was already calling. The wild was not where he went, it was what he was becoming. When adulthood came, he left without ceremony. No farewell, no blessing. He simply walked at dawn, merging with light as if returning to older memory. Behind him, civilization was uncertain of what it had created. Ahead, the world waited, not passively, but expectantly. The forests he entered were older than names. Trees grew like memory. Rivers carved intention. Even air felt weighted, aware of being perceived. Orion walked as though returning home. Days lost count. Survival required no strategy, only instinct. The forest provided or withheld without explanation. Sleep came when the world allowed it. Yet something followed him. Not creature, not sound, but awareness. Like being observed by something older than observation. At night, firelight trembling, he heard shifts in the dark. Not movement, but intention. As if the wilderness was deciding what he would become. One evening, at the edge of a misted clearing, Orion saw tracks. Massive, deep, unnatural. Whatever made them was still near. Waiting, watching. For the first time, anticipation rose within him. Not fear, but recognition of purpose taking form. He tightened his grip on the branch. The wind shifted. The forest went still. And then, as if answering something that had been building since his first breath, Orion stepped forward into the wild that would become his legend. The forest did not resist Orion. It adapted. Paths that once twisted without reason began to open with reluctant clarity as he moved deeper into forgotten reaches. Branches that might have struck another man bent aside at the last moment, as though the trees themselves were unwilling to interfere. Even the wind, ancient, restless, shifted its language when he entered a valley. It was not reverence, it was recognition, as if the wilderness was learning him. Orion did not name the places he crossed. Names belonged to those who needed separation. He did not see separation. He saw continuity, mountain into forest, into river, into sky, all part of one breathing body beneath existence. And within that body, he had become something undeniable. A force that did not ask permission. At first he hunted for survival, a deer at dawn, a boar through reeds, wolves that tested his boundary and learned too late that boundaries did not exist. But survival was a brief language. He outgrew it quickly. What remained was older. Hunting became dialogue, a conversation between predator and world. And Orion always spoke first. The stories began before he returned. A bear vanished from a valley none dared enter. A serpent in the marsh was found dead without wound, coiled as if it had fallen asleep mid-strike. A herd of bulls once stampeded toward a settlement until a single figure stepped forward and the entire mass broke as if meeting an invisible wall. No one saw clearly. Only aftermath. Only silence. And silence becomes myth when explanation is absent. By the time Orion returned to coastal villages, he was already spoken of as something beyond man, the greatest hunter. Not because he claimed it, but because nothing remained to challenge it. He did not correct them. He did not encourage them. He simply existed within the name, as if names were temporary garments the world placed upon him. He carried no trophies, only presence. And that presence changed how men stood when he entered a room. At first they called it fear, but fear implies knowledge of limits. What they felt was worse, the absence of limits itself. Kings sent envoys, not commands, requests disguised as honor. There is a beast in our lands that no army can kill. Orion listened, then left. No ceremony, no reward, only movement. And wherever he went, the impossible lost certainty. In northern forests, a creature with tusks like stone pillars and eyes like embered coal had devoured hunting parties. Men called it curse, others divine punishment. Orion found it at dusk. There was no battle as later songs would claim, only recognition between two forces that understood what they were. The beast charged. The ground broke beneath it. And when it stopped moving, the forest did not celebrate. It exhaled, as if something unbearable had finally been removed. Orion felt no triumph. Triumph requires comparison, and he was losing comparison altogether. The world, once vast and unknowable, was becoming readable, not smaller, but clearer. Every motion of prey, every shift of weather, every instinct revealed itself as if he were remembering rather than learning. And with clarity came something subtle, expectation, not from others, from within. Hesitation no longer arrived in time. Doubt came too late to alter action. His body often moved before thought finished forming, as though thought had become delay. This was when the boundary between man and myth began to thin. Villages no longer spoke of a hunter among them. They spoke of a hunter passing through them, a phenomenon, a force of nature briefly shaped like a man. Orion did not resist the shape forming around him, because somewhere beneath silence and precision, something else was growing. He was no longer surviving the wild. He was becoming its measure. In the highlands where cliffs split the sky and wind carried distant storms, Orion began to enter places no hunter had reason to go, not for game, but because they were not meant to be entered. Sacred groves where animals refused to tread, mountains like broken teeth, rivers too cold for reflection, and still he walked. Each step felt less like intrusion and more like return, as if the world had been waiting for him to reach its edges. One evening, dusk bled copper across the horizon as Orion stood on a ridge above a valley untouched by human presence. No tracks, no smoke, no sound as men understood it. Only stillness. Yet within it, something stirred. Not movement, attention. Orion lowered himself slightly, not in fear, but focus. His senses extended outward, reading meaning where others saw only land. And beneath it all, something else. A presence not bound to the rhythm of the world, watching him as he watched it. For the first time in years, Orion did not move forward. He remained still. The wind shifted, and far beyond sight, something answered the silence with recognition. Not fear, not retreat, acknowledgement, as if the world had finally begun to understand what he was becoming, or perhaps as if something within it had begun preparing itself for him. The forest did not feel the same after her arrival. Nothing changed in form. Trees remained rooted in ancient silence. Rivers kept carving stone, yet the air itself tightened, as if the world had begun holding its breath between two immensities. Orion sensed her before he saw her, not as scent, not as sound, but as alignment, a presence that did not disrupt the wilderness, yet did not belong to it. The land did not bend around her as it did around him. Instead, it responded, like a mirror recognizing another mirror. He stood at the edge of a clearing where white flowers grew in patterns too ordered to be random. Dawn fractured through the canopy, scattering gold like broken divinity. And then she emerged, not entering so much as arriving, as if the world had only just agreed to reveal her. Artemis, no crown, no ornament, no sign of rule, yet nothing about her suggested absence of power. The bow in her hand was not authority, it was extension, like an unspoken sense. Her gaze met Orion's, and for the first time, something unfamiliar settled beneath awareness. Not challenge, not fear, recognition without hierarchy. He did not move, neither did she. The forest remained still, not in reverence, but uncertainty, as if it had never been asked to witness something outside its predator-prey logic. "You walk too far into silence," she said. "Not loud, not soft, necessary, like wind through high branches." Orion studied her as he studied all things. Measurement without curiosity alone. Yet there was nothing incomplete in her, no gap for interpretation. She was whole in a way that resisted reading. "I do not seek silence," he said. "It follows me." A pause, not tension, but calibration, as if the world adjusted distance between them. Artemis stepped forward. One step. The clearing shifted, not physically, but in meaning. "You think it follows you," she said. "You are simply learning how loudly you move." No insult, only observation. Orion's eyes narrowed slightly, not anger, but discomfort at being seen without distortion. Most saw legend or fear. Few saw precisely what was there. She saw neither. She saw scale. He realized she was not impressed and not afraid. For the first time, the world did not revolve around him. It shared space with another axis. Silence deepened. "You hunt here," Orion said. "Not question." Artemis tilted her head as if the word was insufficient. "I maintain balance." "That is what all hunters believe," Orion said. A shift, not emotion, but focus. "And what do you believe you are?" she asked. He looked past her into the deeper woods, where life moved carefully, aware of both. "I end what must end." Artemis exhaled softly. "No, you end what resists you." It did not strike like accusation. It landed like structure being named. For a moment, Orion said nothing. The forest waited, not for judgment, but turning. Then something in him shifted. Not doubt, but reflection. He had not yet named what was becoming clear. The world yielded more easily to him with time. Resistance thinned. Outcomes clarified before action. And now, in her presence, he understood what had been missing. She did not yield. Not because she could not be overcome, but because she did not belong to the same equation. "I do not resist the world," Artemis said, as though continuing a thought he had not spoken. "I move with it. There is a difference." Orion's gaze held. "And yet you stand apart from it." A faint smile. Only those who believe they are at the center confuse distance with separation. Silence lingered longer than speech. Wind passed through the canopy. Neither moved. It was no longer hunter and prey, not mortal and divine, something closer to alignment of opposites that recognized necessity in collision. Artemis turned slightly, looking deeper into the forest. There are things here you have not named. I have named all I encountered, Orion said. Then you have not encountered everything. A boundary, not a warning. She began to walk, not away, but along the clearing's edge, tracing something only she understood. Orion followed at a distance that was neither cautious nor familiar. It simply was. The forest grew denser, sound thinned, light fractured. The world felt older, as if memory thickened beneath them. You are not from this place, Orion said. No one is, Artemis replied. That is not true. She stopped. The forest stopped with her, then turned slightly. And yet you believe you are. The words shifted something, not breaking certainty, but displacing it. Not all truths are pursued. Some are revealed only when met by something that does not move aside. Artemis turned away. We are not alone here, she said quietly. The air changed. Not sound, attention. Beyond perception, the forest responded, not to them separately, but to what their meeting had created. Orion's hand tightened slightly. Artemis did not reach for her bow, because what approached did not belong to prey or predator. It belonged to something older, something that responded to imbalance. Shadows between trees deepened into a shape not yet fully formed, and the silence between them fractured for the first time. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was structured, as if the forest had stopped being a collection of living things and had become a single-held thought, carefully contained beneath something too vast to name directly. Above them, the fracture in the sky did not widen. It refined. Edges of light aligned into patterns that suggested intention rather than chaos. What had once felt like pressure now carried something closer to deliberation, not movement toward action, but attention deciding what action meant. Artemis did not lower her bow, but her stance shifted, not toward aggression, but toward balance. The kind of adjustment made when the world no longer behaves within familiar margins. Orion noticed it. Not her fear, her recalibration. That distinction mattered more than anything else he had witnessed so far. You recognize it, he said quietly. Artemis did not look away from the sky. I recognize what it does, she replied. A pause, then softer. Not what it is. That answer hung between them longer than either of their voices. Orion's eyes narrowed slightly, not in defiance, but in the discomfort of encountering something that could not be reduced through experience alone. Everything he had ever faced could be understood through encounter, resistance, and resolution. This did not offer resolution, only continuation. The presence above shifted again, not closer, not further, but inward. as though compressing its awareness into a finer point of focus. The forest responded instantly, not with panic, with alignment. Branches stilling into exact positions, wind ceasing entirely. Even the distant movement of unseen creatures falling into a kind of suspended obedience. Artemis spoke without lowering her gaze. "This is why we do not draw it near," she said. Orion finally turned his face upward fully. "And yet it is here." Artemis exhaled once, a controlled breath. "Yes," she said, "because something here has already made it relevant." That word, relevant, shifted something in Orion's understanding, not emotionally, structurally, as if a pattern he had been moving through his entire life had suddenly revealed itself as part of a larger system he had never been shown the edges of. "I have killed what others could not," Orion said. It was not pride, it was record. Artemis finally looked at him directly. "And that is exactly the problem." The words did not strike like judgment, they landed like clarification. Above them, the presence stabilized further. Now it felt less like a gaze and more like evaluation becoming irreversible. Not anger, not reward. Something colder in its precision. Categorization. Orion felt it then, not as pressure alone, but as definition attempting to settle onto him, as if something vast was deciding what he was permitted to represent within the structure of existence. For the first time, his instincts did not offer direction. They offered nothing. Artemis took a slow step forward, placing herself slightly between Orion and the deepest point of the sky's fracture, not as shield, but as acknowledgement of roles older than either of them. "This is not a creature," she said, "and it is not a force in the way you understand force." Orion did not move. "Then what responds to me?" he asked. Artemis hesitated, a fraction longer than before. "Balance that has been exceeded," she said finally. The sky pulsed, and with that pulse, something like agreement echoed through the structure of the forest itself. Not spoken, confirmed. Orion felt it clearly now. Everything he had ever done, every moment of effortless dominance, every boundary crossed without resistance, every certainty of outcome, had not gone unnoticed. It had accumulated, not as legend, not as admiration, as weight. Artemis lowered her bow slightly, not in surrender, in recognition that weapons did not apply cleanly here. "You were never meant to be stopped by anything local," she said quietly. "That is why nothing local ever could." Orion's gaze remained fixed upward. "And now?" Artemis answered without hesitation. Now something older notices the imbalance. The word older changed the air again, not with fear, but with scale, as if the forest itself had suddenly become a smaller chapter in a much larger text. Above them, The fractured light condensed further, not into form, but into inevitability, narrowing its focus. And within that narrowing, Orion felt something unfamiliar rise beneath everything he had known before. Not resistance, not aggression, but the beginning of comprehension that he might not be the highest point of the system he had always assumed he occupied. A system not of prey and hunter, but of thresholds and consequences. Artemis spoke one last time, quieter now. "You asked what else there is," she said. Orion did not respond, because for the first time, he was listening without assuming the answer would belong to him. Artemis continued, "There are things that do not hunt you," she said, "because you were never part of their food chain." A pause. "They measure you instead." The sky's fracture tightened, not collapsing, focusing. And in that focus, something within Orion, something that had always equated existence with ascendancy, encountered its first true boundary. Not physical, not temporal, conceptual. He did not yet move, but for the first time in his life, movement was no longer inevitable. It was being awaited. And above them, the silence was no longer absence. It was the moment before recognition becomes consequence. The fracture in the sky did not close. It stabilized, as if whatever had acted through it had not finished, but simply paused, holding the world in a state of unfinished consequence. The forest, however, did not remain suspended with it. It began to return, slowly, unevenly, like memory attempting to reassemble itself after being interrupted mid-thought. Branches regained their weight. Wind returned in hesitant currents. Sound re-entered the space in fragments first, distant, uncertain, as though even noise had to confirm it was still permitted to exist. Artemis did not move at first, not because she was frozen, but because she was listening for something that was no longer there. Orion's presence, not as a body, not as aftermath, but as continuity. There was none, only the absence where inevitability had once been anchored. She lowered her bow fully now. The motion was small, but final. The string still trembled faintly, holding the echo of power it had never been meant to release so close to completion. Light along it faded, reluctant to fully disappear. Artemis turned slightly toward where Orion had stood. The ground there was intact. That was the first wrongness. No crater, no mark, no dramatic sign of struggle that would satisfy the logic of violence. Just space that no longer agreed it had ever contained him in the same way, as if his existence had been removed without insisting on evidence. A correction, not an event. Artemis stepped forward once, then stopped, because stepping further felt unnecessary, not forbidden, unnecessary. The difference mattered. Above her, the sky remained split, not bleeding, not expanding, but holding its fracture like an unfinished sentence. She looked up at it for a long time, not in defiance, not in worship, in acknowledgement. "You didn't take him," she said quietly. Her voice did not echo. The forest no longer granted it that privilege. "You concluded him." The wind shifted, but did not respond. There was no answer, only the subtle sensation that the world had agreed without needing to communicate. Artemis closed her eyes briefly, not in grief, not in relief, in calibration, because something had changed in the structure beneath all things, not locally, not temporarily, but in the way thresholds were defined. Orion had not been a man who crossed boundaries. He had been a man who tested whether boundaries remained meaningful under pressure. And now the world had answered. When she opened her eyes again, the forest looked unchanged. But it was not. Paths felt less certain. Distances felt less absolute. Even silence carried a different density, as though it now remembered what it had been forced to contain. Artemis turned away from the clearing. She did not leave in haste. There was no urgency left in the space, only continuation. As she walked, she felt something settle behind her. Not pursuit, not presence, but consequence distributing itself outward from a point that no longer existed in physical terms. The kind of consequence that does not fade. It propagates. Behind her, the forest slowly resumed its ordinary illusions. But nothing was ordinary anymore, because somewhere in its structure, a reference point had been removed, and the absence of something that once defined the limits of movement changes every path that remains. Above it all, the fractured sky held steady, not closing, not widening, just waiting in a way that suggested Orion had not been erased from the order of things, only translated into something the world no longer needed to host directly. And in that translation, a new principle had been introduced. Not dominance, not survival, but correction that recognizes itself. The forest, in time, would forget the exact shape of what had stood there, but it would not forget the fact that something had once forced it to respond, and that, more than any myth or name or story, would remain, not as memory, but as structure. The forest did not heal. It reorganized. Where Orion had stood, the land no longer remembered continuity in the same way. Trees leaned subtly away from that center, as if refusing to acknowledge a point where meaning had collapsed into something too absolute to revisit. Even the wind avoided lingering there, passing through the clearing like a visitor unwilling to remain too long in a place of unresolved silence. Artemis remained. She did not kneel again. She did not move as hunters move after victory or loss. She stood as something that had witnessed a balance fail without breaking the world entirely with it. The sky above was still fractured, but no longer active, only open, like a wound that had stopped bleeding. but had not yet become scar. She looked down at the ground where Orion had fallen. There was nothing left in the way mortals would understand absence. No body, no trace of struggle, only a faint distortion in the air, like reality itself remembering pressure that no longer existed. Artemis lowered her bow fully. For a long time, she did not speak. Then softly, almost to herself, "You were not meant to end like prey." The words carried no accusation, only recognition of misalignment. The forest remained silent around her, as if unsure whether to continue existing in its previous form. And then the sky answered, not with sound, but with unfolding light. The fracture above widened gently, not violently, revealing something beyond ordinary perception. Not a realm, not a place, but a vast ordering of distance where meaning itself took shape as pattern. Artemis raised her gaze. Even she did not fully resist what came next, because it was not intervention, it was placement. Across the widening heavens, something began to assemble, not built, revealed. A constellation forming where no arrangement had existed before, stars shifting into alignment with deliberate intention, as though the night sky had been waiting to complete a sentence it had long forgotten how to begin. Artemis felt it before she understood it. Not punishment, not reward, but remembrance. The world refusing to let something entirely disappear. And then she saw it, a shape forming in the sky, massive in implication, precise in silence. A figure, a hunter, frozen not in death, but in eternal pursuit. Orion, not as he had been, but as the cosmos now chose to remember him. His form stretched across the heavens in luminous pattern, shoulder drawn back, stance mid-motion, eternally reaching towards something just beyond completion. The great belt of stars aligned like marks of passage, while surrounding light suggested presence rather than body, motion rather than stillness. He was no longer within the world. He had become part of its structure. Artemis did not smile. She did not grieve in the way mortals grieve, but something within her softened, not breaking, not weakening, but acknowledging a truth too vast to resist. Even the greatest force, when removed from the world, does not vanish. It changes scale, and opposite him, far across the sky, distant yet deliberately placed, another pattern emerged, smaller in appearance, but no less precise. A scorpion, curved, patient, eternal. Its position was not random. It faced him, always. A reminder written into the architecture of night that pursuit and consequence are never fully separated. Artemis watched the sky for a long time. The wind returned slowly to the forest, not not as it had been before, but as if learning a new rhythm. She finally spoke again, this time not to the empty clearing, but to the heavens above. "You misunderstood him," she said quietly. A pause, then softer. "And perhaps he misunderstood himself." The stars did not respond. They did not need to, because meaning had already been fixed into them. Below, the forest continued to exist, less certain than before, but still enduring. Life would return. Paths would reform. The wild would resume its quiet cycles of hunger and survival. But something fundamental had shifted. There were now places it would never again fully enter. Artemis turned away from the clearing at last, not in retreat, but in acceptance that even gods do not witness everything without cost. As she walked, the sky above remained unchanged. Orion forever suspended in pursuit, the Scorpion forever waiting in opposition, neither winning, neither ending, both preserved in endless balance. And in that balance, a final truth settled into the world like starlight becoming permanent. Greatness does not prevent falling. It only determines the shape of how one is remembered afterward. And somewhere between hunter and heavens, between pride and inevitability, Orion no longer existed as a man, but as something the universe would never allow to be forgotten.